The frontier was not governed by laws carved in marble or enforced by uniforms of blue. It was a land where justice was swift, often brutal, and decided not in courts but beneath the open sky. In the boom towns and borderlands of the Wild West, ordinary settlers became judges, juries, and executioners. They claimed to defend order, yet often cross into chaos. This is the untold story of vigilante justice on the American frontier, a saga of blood and dust where fear, survival, and power clashed, leaving behind legends, scars, and a haunting question: who decides what justice means? The American frontier in the early 19th century was not merely a place on a map. It was a shifting and contested line between established states and ungoverned wilderness, a borderland where the reach of government, courts, and sheriffs often ended abruptly, leaving behind vast expanses where survival and order depended not on statutes but on the will and determination of settlers themselves. And in those early decades, from the Appalachians stretching into the Ohio River Valley and beyond to the Great Plains, and later further west into the Rocky Mountains, California, and the desert Southwest, communities arose almost overnight, fueled by migration, commerce, and in some cases fevered dreams of wealth, yet lacking the institutions that centuries of European or Eastern seaboard life had taught people to expect as safeguards of daily life. For the early republic, though ambitious, did not have a capacity to project law enforcement into such far-flung territories, and this absence of official authority shaped the culture of the frontier in profound ways. For settlers pushing into Kentucky or Tennessee in the late 18th century often relied on communal defense against both crime and conflict, while later waves of pioneers crossing the Mississippi in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s encountered an even deeper vacuum, where entire towns might exist without a single courthouse, trained lawyer, or appointed sheriff. And in these conditions, disputes over land, theft of livestock, and accusations of violence were settled not in legal chambers but in town meetings, on dusty main streets, or sometimes beneath the shade of a tree with a rope hanging from its branch, creating an environment where justice was improvised, inconsistent, and often brutal, yet understood by those who lived through it as necessary for survival. And the cycle intensified with the rapid transformation brought by the California gold rush of 1848, when hundreds of thousands poured into the Sierra Nevada and San Francisco Bay region, creating chaotic settlements where fortune seekers from America, Latin America, Europe, and China crowded into rough camps with no official structure. And the notorious San Francisco Committee of Vigilance emerged in 1851, and again in 1856, claiming to enforce justice where corrupt city officials could not or would not, executing suspected murderers, deporting foreigners they deemed undesirable, and publicizing their actions as the restoration of civic order. And while these committees provided a sense of security for many citizens, they also demonstrated the dangers of self-appointed authority, for they blurred the line between community protection and mob rule, yet the root cause of their existence was always the same: a frontier where governments were too weak, too distant, or too corrupt to provide reliable law enforcement, a theme repeated in the mining towns of Colorado, Nevada, and Montana, where discovery of gold, silver, or copper brought surges of people and an accompanying spike in crime, and where vigilance committees again appeared, as in Bannack, Montana in 1863, when settlers, outraged by robberies and murders attributed to a band of road agents led by Sheriff Henry Plummer, organized their own tribunal and hanged Plummer and more than 20 others without formal trials. A dramatic episode that illustrated both the necessity felt by frontier citizens and the dangers of circumventing due process. For historians later debated whether all the executed men were guilty or whether vengeance and paranoia had also played their roles. Yet regardless of accuracy, the episode defined the image of frontier justice for generations, because on the margins of settlement, law was not a stable institution but a fragile ideal, something hoped for but rarely achieved, and so people adapted by constructing their own codes, such as the miners' courts in California, Colorado, and elsewhere, informal, assemblies where miners would gather to hear disputes over claims, theft, or violence, delivering verdict by popular vote and enforcing them by threat of banishment or hanging. And while these courts lacked lawyers and often ignored established legal procedure, they reflected a deeply pragmatic culture, where no judge could be summoned, when no marshal could ride for days across rugged terrain. The people would simply act themselves. And this pattern repeated across the frontier, from cattle. Towns in Texas where disputes over rustling was sometimes settled at the end of a rope, to the Nebraska plains where homesteaders defended claims with rifles rather than legal deeds, to the Oregon Trail where wagon trains appointed captains and drafted rules of travel that served as makeshift constitutions in the wilderness. And though the United States Congress and territorial governors eventually established circuits of judges and marshals, their presence was sporadic at best, their reach limited by geography, hostile terrain, and sheer distance, meaning that for decades the frontier was marked by a dual system. On paper, American law existed, but in practice, it was enforced by communities themselves, often through violence, and this environment fostered a culture of honor and retribution, where reputations were fiercely guarded and an insult could escalate into a duel, and where disputes between families might ignite long-lasting feuds, as in the infamous conflict between the Hatfields and McCoys along the Kentucky-West Virginia border in the late 19th century, a feud born of land disputes and Civil War loyalties, but inflamed by the absence of strong institutions to mediate conflict, resulting in decades of revenge killings that became a national symbol of lawlessness. And in examining these beginnings, one must also account for the broader cultural and racial dynamics of the frontier. For indigenous nations who had lived on the land for centuries possessed their own systems of justice and authority, yet these were often ignored or undermined by encroaching settlers who imposed their own rough codes, leading to violent clashes, massacres, and retaliations that settlers described as part of their struggle for survival, but which also reflected the systematic displacement of native societies. And similarly, immigrants from Mexico, China, and Africa often found themselves targeted by vigilante actions, their supposed crimes exaggerated or fabricated. In environments where prejudice easily blended with notions of justice, and in the absence of formal protections, these groups were especially vulnerable, creating a grim record of lynchings, expulsions, and exclusionary violence that punctuated the frontier's growth, reminding us that lawless beginnings were not only about fighting bandits or rustlers, but also about enforcing racial and cultural hierarchies through force. And as the 19th century advanced, the government did attempt to impose stronger systems, with the U.S. Marshal Service extending into territories, federal judges riding circuits, and eventually the establishment of state governments that could support sheriffs and courts. Yet even these were often undermined by corruption, bribery, or the overwhelming pressures of rapid population growth. And so the cycle continued, with vigilantes justified in their own minds as guardians of order, even as critics recognized the dangers of mob rule. And in this environment, the phrase lawless beginnings does not simply mean chaos or anarchy, but rather a period of improvisation, adaptation, and survival in which communities shaped justice to meet their immediate needs, often at terrible cost, laying the foundation for the mythos of the Wild West that persists to this day, a mythos of dusty main streets, horrid trials, and gallows erected at dawn, symbols of society struggling to define order when order was, at best, just a word. When gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California in January 1848, no one could have foreseen the tidal wave of humanity it would unleash. But within a year the news had spread across the United States and around the globe, and by 1849, more than 90,000 people had flooded into California, a mixture of fortune seekers from every walk of life, farmers, merchants, sailors, soldiers, adventurers, and immigrants from Latin America, Europe, China, and Australia, creating a sudden, chaotic society that grew faster than the institutions meant to govern it. And the scale of this migration was staggering, for between 1848 and 1855, nearly 300,000 people made the journey westward, transforming sleepy villages into sprawling boom towns overnight. Yet in this whirlwind of tents, saloons, gambling halls, and hastily constructed shacks, there were no established courts, no professional police forces, and no reliable system of justice, leaving communities vulnerable to theft, violence, and corruption. And in this vacuum, the idea of the Vigilance Committee was born. Groups of self-appointed citizens who claimed the authority to maintain order when the state could not, a practice that began in earnest in San Francisco, the largest and most notorious of the gold rush towns, where the rapid influx of people outpaced any semblance of government control, and the city quickly developed a reputation as a haven for crime, with waterfront gangs like the Sydney Ducks, composed largely of transported convicts from Australia, terrorizing the docks through arson, extortion, and robbery, while corrupt municipal officials either ignored or profited from the chaos, and frustrated citizens began to organize their own form of justice, creating the first San Francisco Committee of Vigilance in June 1851, which swelled to more than 700 members, complete with bylaws, armed patrols, secret tribunals, and a headquarters known as Fort Gunnybags, named after the gunny sacks that lined its walls. And under this improvised authority, the committee arrested dozens of suspects, deported or expelled many, and hanged at least 4 men accused of arson, burglary, or murder, actions carried out in public with great ceremony, designed to demonstrate that order would prevail even if it came from outside official channels. And while some contemporaries praised the committee as a necessary response to rampant lawlessness, others worried about the precedent it set, for these vigilantes operated without accountability, relying on rumor and popular outrage as much as evidence, and their activities revealed how fragile the boundaries were between community defense and mob rule, a tension that would persist across the frontier. And although the 1851 committee disbanded after a few months, its example lingered, and just 5 years later, San Francisco again fell into turmoil, plagued by rampant election fraud, political violence, and a series of high-profile murders, including the assassination of newspaper editor James King of William in May 1856, who had campaigned against political corruption, and in response, citizens resurrected the Vigilance Committee, this time on an even larger scale, boasting nearly 6,000 members, armed cannon, and military-style organization, and over the course of several months they tried and executed several men, including James Casey, the assassin of King of William, and Charles Cora, a gambler accused of murdering a U.S. Marshal, while also deporting or banishing dozens more, seizing control of parts of the city government, and presenting themselves as a moral force of San Francisco. Yet even as it portrayed their mission as restoring civic virtue, critics saw them as unelected tyrants who undermined the very principle of rule of law, and the debate around them became emblematic of frontier vigilantism as a whole. Were they protectors of society or oppressors cloaked in popular support? And beyond San Francisco, the pattern repeated in mining camps across the Sierra Nevada, Colorado, Nevada, and Montana, where vigilance committees emerged to deal with the constant threats of theft, fraud, and violence. For in places like Nevada's Comstock Lode during the silver boom of the 1860s or Colorado's gold camps around Central City and Cripple Creek, entire towns sprang up almost overnight, drawing men who carried both shovels and revolvers. And in such volatile environments, disputes over mining claims often escalated into deadly confrontations, prompting miners to convene miners' courts, where disputes were settled by elected juries of fellow miners, with punishments ranging from fines and claim forfeitures to expulsion or hanging. And while these courts were crude, they reflected the improvisational spirit of frontier justice, combining democratic ideals with brutal efficiency. Yet when criminals operated in gangs or when corruption seeped into town leadership, larger vigilance committees would form, as in Bannack and Virginia City, Montana in the early 1860s, where a shadowy network of road agents allegedly led by Sheriff Henry Plummer terrorized travelers along the trails, robbing and murdering dozens, until a vigilance committee of local settlers took action in December 1863, conducting secret trials and hanging Plummer along with more than 20 of his supposed accomplices in the space of a few weeks. a campaign that left a powerful mark on Western history, for while some historians later questioned whether all of the executed men were truly guilty, the Bannack hangings became a symbol of how frontier citizens believed they had no choice but to seize justice themselves, and in places where vigilance committees operated, their activities often blurred the line between legitimate protection and extrajudicial violence. For while they promised safety and deterrence, they also targeted marginalized groups, political rivals, or anyone deemed disruptive to the fragile order of boomtown life. And this darker side of vigilantism became especially evident in towns where racial tensions ran high, as Chinese immigrants in California mining camps were frequently accused of crimes and subjected to expulsion or violence at the hands of committees, while Mexican and Chilean miners faced harassment, lynching, or forced removal from gold fields under the guise of protecting American claims, revealing how vigilante justice was often infused with prejudice and xenophobia as much as the pursuit of order. Yet despite these injustices, vigilance committees remained a defining feature of the frontier, their presence growing wherever the promise of wealth drew large populations faster than institutions could follow, and the very name Vigilance Committee carried a sense of grassroots authority that resonated with settlers who distrusted distant politicians, believing instead in the moral authority of community action, even if it meant bypassing courts. And as the frontier expanded through the mid-19th century, these committees spread like a shadow across mining towns, cattle ranges, and railhead cities, leaving behind stories that would later be woven into the mythology of the American West, stories of men standing in the town square, reading out verdict before jeering crowds, of gallows constructed in haste beside saloons, of deportations carried out by torchlight, and of citizens who, in the absence of structured law, convinced themselves that justice would be improvised by the will of the majority. Yet in retrospect, these committees tell us not only about crime and punishment, but about the precarious balance of democracy and authoritarianism in frontier life, where the same people who cherished independence and self-government were willing to suspend due process when they feared disorder, a paradox that lay at the heart of frontier society. And it is this paradox that gives the birth of vigilance committees their enduring significance, for they embodied both the resilience and the dangers of a people determined to govern themselves when order was little more than a word. And though the committees eventually faded as state governments expanded, their legacy continued to shape the image of the West, a world of gold fever, gun smoke, and rough justice carried out by ordinary citizens who claimed the right to decide life and death in a land where institutions were still struggling to catch up with the tide of history. On the American frontier, where law enforcement was thin and courts often non-existent, justice was not only improvised through committees or miners' courts, but frequently delivered through the raw force of the mob. For in towns where tempers burned hotter than the desert sun and suspicion spread faster than prairie fire, the crowd itself often assumed the role of judge, jury, and executioner, and this form of collective justice, known most notoriously through lynchings, became one of the most enduring and troubling features of frontier life, born out of necessity in some eyes, but descending easily into vengeance, prejudice, and terror in others. For in a society where isolation, poverty, and sudden violence were constant, the idea of gathering one's neighbors to mete out punishment seemed to many both practical and legitimate, yet in practice it blurred every line between justice and chaos, with the will of the many overwhelming the rights of the few, and one of the earliest and most famous examples can be traced to the frontier settlements of California in the early 1850s, where vigilante committees, fueled by anger at rampant crime and political corruption, conducted public hangings that drew thousands of spectators, transforming punishment into spectacle. But beyond organized committees, spontaneous mobs often assembled in response to theft, murder, or rumors of wrongdoing, particularly in isolated mining camps or cattle towns where the nearest marshal might be hundreds of miles away. And such mobs followed a familiar ritual. An accused man was seized, dragged before the assembled citizens, tried in an impromptu proceeding, often given only minutes to plead, and then, if the verdict was guilty, which it almost always was, marched to the nearest tree or scaffold where a rope awaited, and the sentence was carried out on the spot, frequently cheered by crowds who believed they had restored order through decisive action, and examples abound across the frontier, such as in Placerville, California, nicknamed Hangtown, where in January 1849 3 accused robbers were sentenced by a mob of miners and hanged within hours, cementing the town's grim reputation and setting a tone that would echo across the mining regions. And though some defended these executions as deterrent against chaos, others recognized that such justice was neither impartial nor careful, for the accused often lacked witnesses, defenders, or even time to speak their fates, sealed by the passions of the crowd. And this pattern spread outward with the frontier itself, appearing in Texas cattle country where rustlers were hanged without trial, in Kansas where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed during Bleeding Kansas in the 1850s, executing rivals in makeshift trials, and in Montana, where suspected road agents were rounded up and strung from gallows in Virginia City, all illustrating how quickly mobs could seize power when fear and anger reached a boiling point. And though these gatherings claimed the mantle of justice, they often reflected deeper social divisions, for mobs were not blind arbiters but groups of neighbors, competitors, and sometimes enemies, and their verdicts reflected the prejudices of the time, as seen in California, where Chinese and Mexican immigrants were disproportionately targeted, accused of theft or violence and subjected to expulsion or lynching at rates far beyond their numbers, while in Texas, black men were frequently the victims of mob justice, especially after the Civil War, when white settlers used the ritual of lynching not merely as punishment but as a weapon of racial intimidation, showing that mob justice was as much about enforcing hierarchies of power as it was about deterring crime, and the psychology of the mob itself became a defining part of frontier culture, for in towns where the tension of survival ran high, joining a crowd offered a sense of unity, empowerment, and shared righteousness, and once the momentum of anger began, it was difficult for any individual to resist, for to speak against the mob risked being labeled sympathetic to criminals, and so many who might have hesitated were swept along. And this is why historians often describe frontier lynchings as ritualistic, because they followed patterns that reinforced community solidarity even as they destroyed lives, with processions to the gallows, speeches by vigilante leaders, prayers read over the condemned, and the final act carried out before gathered men, women, and even children, making the execution not only a punishment but a public declaration of who held power in the absence of formal law. Yet the costs of this system are profound. For while some frontier communities credited mob action with reducing crime, the lack of due process meant that innocents could, and did, suffer. Their names lost to history, but their stories whispered in the background of towns eager to justify themselves, and the cycle of mob justice sometimes spiraled into vendettas, as families of the condemned sought revenge, igniting feuds that lasted for years, such as the infamous clashes between rival ranching groups in Texas or mining factions in Colorado, where accusations and retaliations escalated into waves of violence far more destructive than the original crimes. And in examining the role of mobs on the frontier, one must also consider the fragile boundary between necessity and abuse. For while frontier citizens often claimed they had no choice, critics both then and now pointed out that mobs often acted when formal courts did exist, bypassing judges because they distrusted them, or because vengeance was swifter and more satisfying. And this distrust of official authority was especially strong in San Francisco during the 1850s. Where both vigilance committees and ad hoc mobs justified their actions by pointing to corrupt politicians, creating a cycle where faith in government eroded further with each act of extrajudicial punishment, and across the frontier newspapers often fed the flames, printing lurid accounts of crimes and sensationalizing mob hangings, sometimes praising them as moral victories, other times condemning them as barbaric spectacles. And these conflicting voices reflected the larger debate within American society over what justice should mean in a land where institutions lagged behind expansion, a debate embodied in the figure of the lynching crowd, ordinary citizens transformed by fear and anger into instruments of punishment, their actions both a product of their environment and a warning about the fragility of law itself. For if justice can be improvised by the passions of a mob, then justice ceases to be justice at all, and yet for many frontier communities, this improvisation was the only option they believed they had. A grim necessity in a world where survival depended on decisive action, and thus the mob became not an aberration but a recurring institution of the American frontier, its shadows stretching across decades, shaping both the reality of frontier life and the mythology of the Wild West, where the gallows tree and the noose became as iconic as the saloon and the six-shooter, reminders that in those years of blood and dust, the crowd itself often claimed the final word on life and death. On the American frontier, where institutions of government were weak and the enforcement of law unreliable, survival often depended not on written statutes but on unwritten codes, and among the most enduring of these was a frontier code of honor, a cultural system that elevated personal reputation, demanded respect, and sanctioned revenge when one's dignity or community standing was challenged. For in a society where men and women lived by their word, where deeds carried more weight than documents, and where formal courts were absent or distrusted, reputation became a form of social currency, determining not only how one was treated in business, politics, or personal relations, but also whether one could survive in a dangerous and uncertain environment. And this frontier code drew from deep historical traditions, influenced by the honor cultures of the American South, by European dueling practices, and by the violent customs of clan feuds in Scotland and Ireland, carried westward by settlers whose understanding of justice rested as much on personal standing as on communal rules. And so, across the plains, mountains, and deserts, disputes that might otherwise have been settled in courtrooms were resolved through confrontations that blended ritual with violence, as insults, accusations, or perceived slights quickly escalated into duels, fistfights, shootouts, or long-lasting feuds, each one reinforcing the idea that no man could afford to appear weak or dissonant, for to do so risked losing not only respect but also livelihood, as trust was the glue that bound frontier communities together. The most famous example of this honor culture on the frontier was the tradition of the duel, which persisted even after dueling had been outlawed in most of the United States, for men of the frontier clung to the notion that personal disputes could only be settled by facing one's opponent with pistols or blades, as in the infamous duel between Senator David C. Broderick of California and former Chief Justice David S. Terry in 1859, a deadly confrontation sparked by political rivalry and personal insult that ended with Broderick mortally wounded, a tragedy that revealed how deeply notions of honor still shape public life in the West, even among its most prominent leaders, and though formal duels gradually declined by the 1860s, the ethos of personal combat remained, most famously in the quick-draw gunfight, immortalized in tales of the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona in 1881, where the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday faced the Clanton McLaury gang in a violent clash born as much from mutual distrust and insult as from law enforcement duties, and while dime novels and later Hollywood films exaggerated these episodes into symbols of Western drama, the underlying reality was that such confrontations were rooted in the frontier's obsession with reputation. For men like Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, and Clay Allison built their legends not only on their skills with firearms but on their ability to project fearlessness and command respect, knowing that reputation alone could deter challenges in a world where legal protection was uncertain. Yet the code of honor was not confined to famous lawmen and outlaws, for in ordinary towns and settlements, accusations of cheating at cards, dishonesty in trade, or insult to family could provoke violent retaliation, with saloons serving as arenas where drunken words often led to deadly consequences, and newspapers of the time regularly reported shootings described as affairs of honor, reflecting a culture where violence was accepted as a legitimate means of defending one's standing. This code also extended beyond individuals to families and communities, giving rise to blood feuds that could last for generations, the most notorious of which was the Hatfield-McCoy feud along the Kentucky-West Virginia border from the 1860s to the 1890s, a conflict fueled by disputes over land, allegations of theft, and above all wounded pride. which escalated into cycles of revenge killings that claimed dozens of lives and captured national attention, serving as a stark reminder of how deeply honor and vengeance could embed themselves in frontier culture, and similar though less famous feuds erupted in Texas, New Mexico, and Montana, often involving ranching families or political rivals, their violence perpetuated by the unwillingness of either side to appear weak or dissonant. On the cattle frontier, disputes over branding, grazing rights, and accusations of rustling frequently escalated into violent reprisals, sometimes sparking range wars that consumed entire regions, such as the Johnson County War in Wyoming in 1892, where powerful cattle barons hired gunmen to eliminate alleged rustlers, leading to a bloody conflict with small ranches that reflected not only economic tensions but also the honor-based refusal of both sides to yield. And in New Mexico, the Lincoln County War of the late 1870s, involving figures such as Billy the Kid, was similarly fueled by rival factions unwilling to accept addition or defeat, resulting in years of bloodshed that once again highlighted the destructive potential of the frontier code. Nor was this code limited to men, for women on the frontier also understood the importance of reputation, though often framed in terms of morality, respectability, and family honor, and accusations of promiscuity, infidelity, or impropriety could destroy a woman's standing, prompting families to defend female honor with violence when they believed it had been impugned, a practice carried over from older Southern and European traditions, and in some cases women themselves demanded vengeance or actively participated in feuds to uphold their family's reputation. The frontier code also shaped politics and civic life, for elections in frontier towns were often violent contests where accusations of corruption or insult led to brawls or shootings, and politicians themselves were expected to defend their honor physically if challenged, reinforcing culture where personal standing outweighed institutional authority. This obsession with reputation carried profound consequences, for while it provided a form of social cohesion, deterring deceit, theft, and cowardice, it also perpetuated cycles of violence that destabilized communities, undermined emerging legal institutions, and contributed to the myth of the Wild West as a land of constant conflict. Yet the persistence of this code reflected the realities of frontier life, in a world where sheriffs could not always protect citizens, where courts were slow or corrupt, and where survival often hinged on trust. Individuals relied on reputation as both shield and weapon, projecting strength to prevent challenges and resorting to vengeance when their honor was questioned, and this dynamic was further amplified by the cultural diversity of the frontier, where traditions of Spanish, Mexican, Native American, and immigrant honor codes blended uneasily, sometimes clashing violently, further entrenching the cycle of revenge. Historians argue that this culture of honor was not merely a vestige of older traditions, but an adaptive mechanism for societies without stable institutions. Yet over time, as statehood spread, as railroads connected towns, and as formal legal systems took root, the reliance on personal codes of honor gradually diminished, though never disappeared entirely. For even into the 20th century, lynchings, feuds, and gunfights persisted in parts of the West, echoes of a cultural inheritance that placed personal standing above law. The mythology of the frontier has since romanticized this code, presenting it as rugged individualism or cowboy justice. Yet beneath the legend lies a harsher truth, that in the lawless beginnings of the American West, honor and revenge often replaced justice, with reputations won and lost not in courtrooms but in dusty duels, midnight feuds, and the smoke of six-shooters, each one a testament to a society where survival was measured not only in land or gold, but in the fragile currency of respect. Among the most striking episodes in the history of frontier vigilantism were the famous trial conducted not in formal courtrooms, but in barns, saloons, and hastily erected meeting halls, trials carried out by committees of settlers convinced that the established institutions of justice were too slow, too corrupt, or too distant to protect their communities, and these events, remembered in newspapers, diaries, and later in history books, reveal both the determination of frontier citizens to impose order and the dangers of justice shaped by fear and fury rather than due process. For unlike spontaneous lynchings carried out by mobs, these trials often presented themselves as organized proceedings, complete with charges, testimony, and verdicts, yet they lacked the safeguard of impartial judges or defense attorneys, and their outcomes were often predetermined by public outrage, creating a unique blend of ritual, community theater, and extrajudicial punishment that defined the era. One of the most famous of these episodes unfolded in Bannack and Virginia City, Montana Territory, in the winter of 1863 to 64, when a wave of stagecoach robberies and murders plagued the region, crimes attributed to a band of road agents led, shockingly, by the local sheriff, Henry Plummer, whose reputation as both lawman and outlaw remains one of the most debated in frontier history. For according to the accounts of vigilantes, Plummer headed a network of thieves and killers who preyed on travelers along the gold trails, prompting settlers to form a vigilance committee in December 1863 after the murder of a well-liked Dutch miner named Nicholas Tybalt. And in the weeks that followed, the committee arrested dozens of suspects, conducted summary trials, and executed more than 20 men, including Plummer himself, who was hanged on January 10th, 1864, just months after being elected sheriff. And though many at the time praised the vigilante for ending a reign of terror, historians lay to question whether all those executed were truly guilty, suggesting that some may have been caught in the sweep of paranoia. Yet regardless of the accuracy, the trials of Bannack and Virginia City became legendary, shaping the mythos of frontier justice as swift, decisive, and merciless. Another dramatic case occurred in San Francisco in 1856, when the Vigilance Committee tried James P. Casey, a city supervisor accused of murdering newspaper editor James King of William after King published an article exposing Casey's criminal past. And in a spectacle that gripped the city, the committee held Casey in its fortress-like headquarters known as Fort Gunny Bags, conducted a public trial attended by crowds of citizens, and sentenced him to death alongside Charles Cora, a gambler, accused of killing U.S. Marshal William Richardson, and both men were hanged before thousands of onlookers on May 22, 1856, an event that demonstrated both the immense power vigilantes could wield and the dangers of bypassing established institutions. For though Casey had indeed killed King of William, the committee's seizure of power blurred the line between civic duty and mob rule, effectively suspending the authority of the courts and declaring itself the true guardian of justice in the city. In Colorado, similar trials emerged during the 1860s in booming mining camps such as Central City and Boulder, where claim disputes, theft, and murder prompted miners to convene courts of their own. And while some of these miners' courts reflected democratic ideals, with juries elected from among the miners and testimony heard from both sides, others quickly devolved into kangaroo proceedings where the verdict was shaped less by evidence than by the collective desire for swift resolution, often ending in hangings carried out within hours. And newspapers reported these events with both fascination and unease, praising the courage of citizens while warning of the dangers of unchecked power. The story repeated itself in Texas during the Reconstruction era, where the absence of stable law enforcement after the Civil War led to waves of vigilantism, particularly against cattle thieves and alleged rustlers, and in towns such as Lampazers or Gonzales, committees formed to arrest suspects, try them before panels of local men, and deliver sentences ranging from whipping to hanging, with trials conducted in public to reinforce the moral authority of the community. Yet these same structures were often turned against political rivals or freedmen, revealing how easily vigilante trial could be weaponized for social and racial control. In New Mexico during the Lincoln County War of the late 1870s, vigilante trials played out as part of a larger feud between rival mercantile factions, with figures such as Billy the Kid caught in the crossfire. And here the use of vigilante proceedings to justify killings and reprisals illustrated how blurred the line had become between lawful self-defense, organized vigilantism, and outright gang warfare. The psychological power of these trials lay in their theatricality, for they were not conducted in secret but staged as public rituals meant to restore community confidence, with suspects paraded before crowds, verdicts read aloud, and executions carried out in full view, transforming justice into performance. and this performance was central to their legitimacy, for in the absence of formal courts, the sight of neighbors acting together gave citizens the impression of order, even if the process lacked fairness. And it is here that the tension of frontier vigilantism is most visible. These trials were both attempts to impose stability and demonstrations of instability, revealing how fragile the rule of law remained in expanding territories. The fear that drove them was real, for robberies, murders, and corruption did plague frontier towns, and many settlers genuinely believed that without decisive action their communities would collapse into chaos. Yet the fury with which trials were conducted often overwhelmed the possibility of justice, producing outcomes that left scars long after the immediate crisis had passed, as families of the condemned sought revenge, or as later historians uncovered evidence of innocence ignored in the heat of the moment. These famous vigilante trials also had lasting consequences for the development of the West, for they shaped public attitudes toward law enforcement, sometimes encouraging the formation of stronger state institutions to prevent future extrajudicial violence, but in other cases reinforcing the belief that citizens have both the right and duty to take justice into their own hands, a belief that continued well into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, fueling not only frontier vigilantism but also the wave of lynchings that plagued the United States in later decades. In retrospect, the famous trials of Bannack, San Francisco, and countless mining camps stand as both symbols of the frontier's improvisational spirit and warnings about the dangers of justice untethered from law, for while they reflected communities struggling to survive in dangerous environments, they also revealed how quickly fear and fury could eclipse fairness, and how the line between protection and persecution could vanish when justice was defined by the passions of the crowd. The story of frontier vigilantism is often told in terms of brave citizens defending their communities against outlaws, rustlers, and corrupt politicians. But history reveals a darker, more unsettling reality. Many times, vigilance committees and mobs went too far, transforming from guardians of order into instruments of terror, using the language of justice to mask acts of vengeance, prejudice, and political domination. And in doing so, they left behind legacies of bloodshed that haunted the very communities they claimed to protect. For while some vigilante movements began with genuine fears of crime or lawlessness, their unchecked power, lack of accountability, and susceptibility to mass hysteria often led to excesses that rivaled or even exceeded the violence they sought to suppress. And perhaps the clearest examples of this can be seen in the racial violence that swept through the frontier under the guise of vigilantism. As Chinese immigrants in California, Mexican miners in the Southwest, and African Americans across Texas and Kansas found themselves disproportionately targeted by mobs who accused them of crimes but whose real motives lay in exclusion, competition, and the desire to enforce racial hierarchies, with lynchings, expulsions, and massacres justified as community protection, when in reality there were often brutal campaigns of intimidation. In California, for instance, the influx of Chinese laborers during the gold rush and later during construction of the Central Pacific Railroad provoked widespread hostility, and vigilante groups frequently singled them out, accusing them of theft, opium use, or prostitution, leading to expulsions from mining camps and even massacres such as the Los Angeles Chinese Massacre of 1871, when a mob of nearly 500 Anglos and Latinos stormed the city's Chinese Quarter, dragging men from their homes, lynching 19, and looting businesses, an atrocity carried out in the name of civic order but remembered today as one of the darkest chapters of racial violence in the American West. In Texas, vigilante violence after the Civil War often targeted freedmen, with mobs accusing black men of crimes ranging from theft to assault and executing them without trial, a continuation of the antebellum culture of racial control now disguised as frontier justice, and in borderlands like New Mexico and Arizona. Mexican and Mexican-American communities were often accused of cattle rustling or banditry and subjected to vigilante lynchings, their deaths serving as both punishment and warning. That power in the region belonged to Anglo settlers, not the long-established Hispanic population. These episodes reveal the degree to which vigilantism could be less about justice and more about consolidating social and political dominance. And even in cases where actual crime was involved, the fury of the mob often far exceeded the offense, as in the so-called extravagant hangings of suspected horse thieves, where men were executed for stealing livestock, a crime that in more stable settings might have led to imprisonment, but on the frontier became ground for death with communities, rationalizing the disproportionate punishment as a deterrent, though in practice it often brutalized society further. The San Francisco committees of vigilance themselves, often remembered as symbols of civic reform, also demonstrate how quickly vigilantes could overreach. For while their early actions targeted known criminals, they soon expanded their scope to include political enemies, exiling rivals, seizing control of city functions, and in the process undermining the very democratic institutions they claimed to protect. And critics at the time argued that the committees had become oligarchies, wielding power through fear and coercion rather than law, a reminder that vigilantism was never immune from corruption. In Montana, the Bannack Vigilantes, after hanging Sheriff Henry Plummer and his alleged gang in 1864, continued their campaigns into Virginia City and surrounding camps, executing men on scant evidence, and though the initial actions may have reduced crime, later hangings appeared motivated as much by paranoia and the desire to cement authority as by actual guilt, and some families of the executed fled the region in fear, convinced that innocence was no shield against the rope once a community was seized by hysteria. Likewise, in frontier towns like Denver, Deadwood, and Dodge City, so-called vigilance groups sometimes acted as thinly veiled protection rackets, using the language of order while extorting businesses, intimidating immigrants, or suppressing labor unrest, demonstrating how easily self-styled guardians of justice could mutate into tools of exploitation. The most frightening excesses came when mobs abandoned even the pretense of trial, as in the case of spontaneous lynchings where men were seized and executed within minutes, often in broad daylight, with little more than rumor as evidence. And newspapers of the time occasionally condemned these killings as disgraceful, though just as often they printed sensationalist accounts that glorified them, feeding the cycle of fear and violence. The effect on communities was corrosive, for while some citizens initially felt safer, the knowledge that anyone could be accused and condemned without recourse eroded trust and created climates of suspicion, with personal grudges easily disguised as moral crusades. Political vigilantism also took hold in parts of the South and West, where groups like the Ku Klux Klan cloaked their racial terror in the rhetoric of community justice, showing how the vigilante tradition, born on the frontier, could be twisted into campaigns of systemic oppression. Its tools, masks, night rides, summary trials, repurposed to terrorize entire populations. The very imagery of frontier vigilantism, the noose and the gallows, became national symbols of mob violence, their meaning stretching beyond the West into the broader American landscape, where lynching would claim thousands of lives in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet even when excesses were obvious, frontier communities often rationalized them as necessary evils, a reflection of the deep insecurity that pervaded settlement life. For in a world where law was unreliable, people clung to the idea that swift and brutal punishment was the only way to preserve order, even when the results left more blood in the streets than peace in the town. In truth, the moments when vigilantes went too far are as much a part of frontier history as the tales of courageous citizens standing against outlaws, and they remind us that without checks and balances, even well-intentioned movements can descend into tyranny, their legacy not safety but fear, not justice but cycles of vengeance that scar communities for generations. On the American frontier, where rumor traveled faster than law and public opinion often determined guilt or innocence, newspapers played a decisive role in shaping how communities perceived crime, justice, and vigilantism. For in an era before telegraph became widespread and decades before radio or film, the printed page was the most powerful tool for spreading information, and frontier journalism thrived on drama, exaggeration, and moral outrage, making it both the watchdog of society and the accelerant of mob justice, and the relationship between vigilante movements and the press became one of the most dangerous feedback loops in 19th century America, as editors eager for sale fed readers sensational accounts of crime while at the same time justifying, excusing, or glorifying extrajudicial punishment, fueling a culture where the noose and the gallows seemed not only acceptable but necessary. In San Francisco during the 1850s, the rise of the vigilance committees was accompanied step for step by the press, with papers such as the Daily Alta California and the Bulletin publishing inflammatory reports of corruption, crime, and civic collapse, painting vivid pictures of thieves prowling the waterfront and politicians colluding with gangs. And when the 1856 committee seized and executed James Casey and Charles Cora, thousands gathered not only because of the spectacle, but because newspapers had primed the city with weeks of lurid detail, casting Casey as a villain and King of William, the assassinated editor of the Bulletin, as a martyr for civic virtue, and the execution itself was reported in dramatic prose, often with little regard for objectivity, transforming what might have been seen as a troubling usurpation of power into a triumphant display of popular justice. Across the frontier, similar dynamics unfolded, for mining towns in Colorado, Nevada, and Montana depended on small local papers for information, and editors quickly learned that crime stories sold more copies than any other subject, so accounts of robberies, murders, and lynchings were written with theatrical flair, complete with dialogue, detailed descriptions of facial expressions, and warnings about the dangers of lawlessness. And when vigilantes acted, these same papers often praised them as brave citizens defending their homes, rarely questioning whether the accused had truly been guilty, and in doing so they legitimized the committees while feeding readers' appetite for drama. The role of newspapers in Bannack and Virginia City, Montana, during the Plummer hangings of 1863-64 was particularly revealing, for the Montana Post, the territory's first major newspaper, openly supported the vigilantes, framing their actions as a righteous response to lawlessness, and its editor, Thomas J. Dimsdale, later published The Vigilantes of Montana, a book that became a classic of Western literature, portraying the executions as heroic and necessary, a narrative that endured for decades and shaped the national mythology of the Wild West. Yet historians today recognize that Dimsdale's coverage glossed over the murky evidence and potential miscarriages of justice, demonstrating how journalism not only reported vigilante actions but actively constructed their legacy. The frontier press also had the power to inflame racial violence, as seen in California and Texas, when newspapers frequently printed editorials warning of foreign criminals in mining camps or Negro desperados in rural counties, language that encouraged communities to see entire groups as threats, paving the way for vigilante expulsions and lynchings, and the Los Angeles Chinese Massacre of 1871, in which 19 Chinese men were lynched by a mob, were preceded by weeks of hostile coverage in local papers portraying Chinese residents as gamblers and criminals, coverage that gave legitimacy to the mob's actions even as later editorials lamented the scale of the violence. Sensationalist reporting also spread beyond local communities through the rapidly expanding network of national papers, as accounts of frontier lynchings and vigilante trials were reprinted in New York, Boston, and Chicago, feeding Eastern readers' fascination with the Wild West and reinforcing stereotypes of a region governed by violence and honor rather than law. And this national coverage in turn fueled dime novels and popular culture, ensuring that the image of vigilante justice would endure as part of American folklore, half myth, half truth, its origins rooted in the dramatic prose of 19th century journalists. Yet not all newspapers supported vigilantism, for there were courageous editors who condemned mob rule, warning that it undermined the very principles of democracy and due process, and in some cases these editors paid with their lives, as James King of William himself did in San Francisco in 1856, assassinated by Casey after exposing political corruption, an event that both demonstrated the power of the press to challenge entrenched interests and revealed the risks faced by journalists in turbulent frontier societies. Even when opposing vigilantism, However, newspapers could not resist sensationalism, for criticism often came wrapped in the same lurid descriptions of crime and punishment that sold papers, meaning that even in opposition, journalism contributed to the cycle of fear and spectacle. The speed with which information spread through the press also amplified the tempo of mob justice, for rumors of crimes reported in morning editions could bring angry crowds into the streets by evening, their anger intensified by the authority of print. And once a vigilante action was carried out, newspapers provided the post hoc justification, assuring readers that justice had been done and presenting the executed as villains whose removal was a communal victory, reinforcing the legitimacy of extrajudicial violence. This feedback loop shaped not only frontier society but the development of American journalism itself, for frontier editors learned that their survival depended as much on drama as on accuracy, and their pages reflected the anxieties, prejudices, and desires of their readers, turning justice into narrative and punishment into spectacle. And as the century progressed, these habits of sensational reporting migrated into the broader culture, influencing national attitudes toward crime, punishment, and race long after the frontier had closed. The newspapers that fed the fire did not invent vigilantism, but they magnified it, dramatized it, and enshrined it in the public imagination, ensuring that the image of the citizen jury, the midnight committee, and the gallows in the town square would remain central to America's understanding of its Western past. And in the process, they remind us that the history of vigilante justice cannot be told without the history of the press. For the frontier news and the frontier newspaper were, in many ways, two sides of the same story. When we think of frontier vigilantism, the images that come most readily to mind are of armed men gathered in saloons, dusty streets, or under the shadow of hastily built gallows. Yet women were not absent from this story. They were present in ways both direct and indirect, sometimes as silent victims, sometimes as participants, and often as figures whose lives were shaped by decisions made in the name of justice without law. And their role in the shadow of vigilante justice reveals much about the gendered nature of the American frontier and the broader struggles of survival in a society defined by violence, uncertainty, and fragile institutions. For though the frontier is often portrayed as a male world of miners, cowboys, and gunfighters, women were there from the beginning, migrating westward with families, running boarding houses, working as laundresses, prostitutes, teachers, and wives, and their presence made them vulnerable to both the protection and the wrath of vigilante groups. In many communities, women were cast as symbols of virtue and respectability, and protecting their safety became one of the rhetorical justifications for vigilante action, with newspapers and committee leaders often invoking the threat of assaults on women as evidence of lawlessness, even when cases were exaggerated or fabricated. And this rhetoric reveals how women's bodies and reputations were used as political tools, their perceived vulnerability serving to legitimize the violence of men who claimed to act in defense of community morality. At the same time, women themselves sometimes supported or even participated in vigilante movements, offering food, shelter, or information to committees, writing editorials in local papers, or joining the crowds that gathered to witness trials and executions. And in a few rare cases, women even played active roles in enforcing mob justice, as when accounts describe wives or mothers demanding the punishment of men accused of crimes against their families, their voices carrying moral weight that committees used to justify their decisions. But the shadow side of this involvement was that women were also targets of vigilante justice, particularly those whose behavior challenged frontier notions of morality, for prostitutes and women accused of loose living were frequently harassed, expelled, or punished by committees who claimed to uphold decency, and while men who gambled or drank excessively might be tolerated, women whose livelihoods or independence placed them outside the boundaries of respectability were often subjected to harsher scrutiny, their fates decided not by law but by the shifting standards of male-dominated communities. Cases abound in mining towns of the Sierra Nevada and Montana where prostitutes were run out of camps by vigilance committees or beaten in public as warnings to others. Their stories rarely recorded in official history but preserved in scattered newspaper accounts and diaries. Reminders that vigilante justice was not only about punishing criminals but about policing morality and gender roles in societies struggling to define themselves. Even respectable women, however, were not immune to the consequences of vigilante excess, for when men were executed by committees, sometimes on flimsy evidence, their wives and children bore the stigma and hardship of being connected to the condemned, often forced to flee towns under threat of further violence, their lives shattered by verdicts rendered without recourse. In Bannack, Montana, after Sheriff Henry Plummer was hanged in 1864 along with more than 20 alleged road agents, many of their wives were ostracized or driven out of the mining camps, accused of being complicit in crimes despite having no role, their children growing up under the shadow of infamy created by vigilante judgment. Women of color face even harsher realities, as Mexican, Chinese, and Native American women were frequently caught in the crossfire of vigilante violence, sometimes attacked or expelled alongside male relatives, their communities targeted not only for alleged crimes but for their very presence, with vigilantes framing their actions as protection of American values while in practice enforcing racial exclusion. The Chinese Massacre of 1871 in Los Angeles, in which 19 Chinese men were lynched by a mob, left dozens of women widowed and families destroyed, their lives erased from the narrative even as newspapers sensationalized the deaths of men. And in Texas, vigilante actions against Mexican ranching families often included assaults on women, framed as retribution for alleged thefts or raids, revealing how gender and ethnicity intersected in the violence of extrajudicial justice. At the same time, women occasionally resisted vigilantism, raising voices of protest in communities where mob violence threatened to spiral out of control, and in some cases female teachers, church leaders, or writers condemned lynchings in print, warning that they degraded the moral fiber of society, though such voices were often drowned out by the louder chorus of justification. One striking example comes from Kansas during the turbulent Bleeding Kansas years of the 1850s, when some women involved in abolitionist movements spoke out against the use of mob violence to settle political disputes, arguing that it betrayed the very principles of freedom and law they sought to establish. Their words a rare but important reminder that not everyone on the frontier accepted vigilantism as inevitable or righteous. The personal diaries and letters of frontier women also provide glimpses into how vigilante justice shaped daily life, with entries describing fear of mobs gathering outside homes, sorrow for neighbors executed, or relief when committees expelled suspected criminals, illustrating complex and often ambivalent ways women experience these events. For some, vigilantes represented safety in a world where husbands or fathers were absent for weeks at a time working claims or driving cattle. For others, they represented terror, a reminder that order rested on the shifting moods of armed men rather than on stable laws. And in the broader cultural memory of the West, women's roles in vigilantism have often been marginalized, overshadowed by the more dramatic stories of gunfighters and committees, yet their experiences, whether as symbols, supporters, victims, or resistors, reveal the full human cost of justice without law, a cost borne not only by those who face the rope but by families, households, and communities left to pick up the pieces afterward. In this sense, women in the shadows of vigilante justice remind us that frontier violence was not confined to saloon brawls or outlaw shootouts, but reached into homes, marriages, and the intimate fabric of daily life, shaping the West in ways both visible and unseen, their voices often silenced yet essential to understanding the true legacy of blood and dust on the American frontier. The story of vigilante justice on the American frontier cannot be told without acknowledging the profound impact it had on indigenous nations, whose own systems of law, order, and survival long predated the arrival of Euro-American settlers. For when settlers pushed westward in the 18th and 19th centuries, they entered lands governed not by chaos but by the traditions and authority of native communities, each with its own rules for conflict resolution, restitution, and leadership. Yet these systems were dismissed or ignored by incoming settlers who imposed their own rough codes, creating a clash not only of cultures but of concepts of justice. And in the violent crucible of the frontier, this clash often ended in bloodshed, displacement, and the destruction of indigenous sovereignty. To understand this dimension of frontier vigilantism, one must recognize that native nations, from the Iroquois Confederacy in the east to the Lakota, Cheyenne, Apache, and Navajo in the west, had sophisticated mechanisms for justice, including councils, clan systems, and restorative practices aimed at repairing harm rather than exacting retribution. And while war and raiding were part of their traditions, they were balanced by systems designed to maintain equilibrium within and between tribes. Yet when American settlers encountered these practices, they often dismissed them as primitive or illegitimate. And when conflict arose, settlers rarely sought mediation through native systems, but instead turned to their own self-fashioned justice, forming vigilance committees that frequently targeted native people not as individuals accused of crimes, but as whole communities deemed threats to expansion. From the earliest days of westward settlement, accusations of horse theft, raids, or violence were enough to spark retaliatory campaigns by settler militias, which often blurred the line between defensive action and vigilante violence, as in the case of the 1782 Naden-Hutton massacre in Ohio, where Pennsylvania militiamen executed nearly 100 Christianized Delaware men, women, and children in retaliation for raids they had not committed, an atrocity rationalized as frontier justice but in reality an indiscriminate slaughter born of fear, vengeance, and prejudice. This pattern repeated throughout the 19th century, as native resistance to land encroachment was met not only by official U.S. Army campaigns, but also by spontaneous or organized vigilante attacks, often with tacit government approval, and settlers justified these actions as necessary for survival, framing them as responses to lawlessness even when they amounted to massacres. In California, the gold rush brought a devastating wave of vigilante violence against native peoples, as miners and settlers accused them of theft or attacks and organized posses to hunt them down, resulting in what historians now recognize as campaigns of extermination, with dozens of massacres carried out under the banner of citizen protection. One of the most infamous was the 1853 Yontucket Massacre in northwestern California, where vigilantes slaughtered more than 400 Toloa people during a ceremonial gathering, justifying the massacre as retaliation for livestock thefts, though the scale and indiscriminate nature of the killings made clear that this was less about justice and more about the removal of indigenous presence. In Colorado, the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, though led by Colonel John Chivington and U.S. volunteers, bore many of the hallmarks of vigilante action, as settler militias carried out attacks on a largely peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment, killing more than 150, many of them women and children, while presenting the atrocity as a defense of frontier communities. And similar attacks occurred in Texas, New Mexico, and the Dakota Territory, where vigilante violence blurred with military campaigns, all driven by the conviction that indigenous nations represented a threat to order and settlement. Even in smaller, localized contexts, native individuals accused of crimes such as theft, assault, or murder were often denied any semblance of fair process and instead subjected to lynchings, expulsions, or summary executions by settler mobs, their lives deemed expendable in the pursuit of settler security, and newspapers frequently inflamed these tensions by portraying native suspects as inherently violent, reinforcing the cycle of fear and retaliation. Yet indigenous communities did not simply endure this violence passively. They resisted through both armed defense and continued assertion of their own justice systems, attempting to hold on to traditions of restorative justice even in the face of encroachment, and in some cases native leaders appealed to U.S. authorities for protection against vigilante violence, though such appeals were rarely met with meaningful action, leaving indigenous people trapped between the inadequacy of federal law and the brutality of settler vigilantism. The long-term consequences of this clash were immense. Not only did vigilante violence contribute to the physical destruction of native populations, but it also delegitimized indigenous systems of justice in the eyes of both settlers and federal authorities, paving the way for policies that impose American legal structures on native nations. From the reservation system to the establishment of Indian police and courts of Indian offenses in the late 19th century, institutions designed not to preserve indigenous sovereignty but to assimilate native peoples into the settler model of law and order. In this way, the story of the indigenous frontier reveals vigilantism as more than a response to crime. It was a tool of conquest, a means by which settlers enforced their dominance, justified dispossession, and advanced the expansion of the United States under guise of maintaining order. Yet the resilience of native communities, their survival despite the violence, and the persistence of their cultural traditions remind us that even in the darkest chapters of frontier vigilantism, indigenous voices endured, often recorded in oral histories that counter the narratives of newspapers and dime novels, offering a perspective that reveals the true cost of justice when order was defined only by the settlers' terms. To look at the frontier solely through the lens of committees, mobs, and hangings is to miss this deeper truth, that for native nations, the arrival of vigilante justice was not the restoration of order, but the dismantling of their own systems of balance, a dismantling that brought devastation yet also sparked enduring resistance, ensuring that the clash between two visions of justice, one communal and restorative, the other extrajudicial and retributive, remained central to the story of the American West. The advance of a railroad across the American West in the mid to late 19th century transformed the landscape of vigilantism, for the iron tracks that stretched from Missouri to California did more than carry settlers, goods, and soldiers. They brought with them new opportunities for crime, new targets for outlaw gangs, and new justifications for communities to take justice into their own hands. And in this volatile environment, the figure of the outlaw became both a real threat and a cultural symbol, hunted as a criminal yet romanticized as a rebel, while the noose, the enduring tool of frontier vigilantism, remained a weapon of choice for those who claimed to defend order when law lagged behind. The completion of the first transcontinental railroad in 1869 symbolized a triumph of progress, but it also created a new theater for violence, as trains laden with payrolls, gold shipments, and supplies became irresistible targets for bandits, and the vast stretches of unpoliced land between stations gave outlaws space to strike and vanish, testing the limits of federal and local authority. Among the most infamous were gangs like the James Younger Gang, led by former Confederate guerrilla Jesse James, who turned their wartime experience into a campaign of robberies across Missouri, Kansas, and beyond, targeting trains and banks while cultivating a reputation as avengers of Southern honor, a reputation eagerly amplified by newspapers that painted them alternately as folk heroes and ruthless killers. In 1873, the James Younger Gang carried out one of the earliest successful train robberies near Dare, Iowa, derailing a locomotive and looting its safe, a crime that shocked the nation and emboldened imitators, forcing railroad companies to hire armed guards, detectives, and Pinkerton agents to combat the new wave of outlaws. Yet for many frontier communities, official responses were too slow or ineffective, and so vigilance committees again took shape, determined to protect the lifeline of the railroad and to mete out swift punishment to those who threatened it, with captured bandits often subjected not to lengthy trials, but to summary hangings carried out near the very tracks they had sought to exploit, the noose serving both as execution and as warning to others. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific lines, along with countless regional spurs, became magnets for violence, and stories of lynch train robbers circulated widely, feeding the perception that only immediate, invisible punishment could preserve order in a world where railroads symbolized civilization's advance into lawless spaces. But the railroad's entanglement with vigilantism was not limited to banditry. It also intersected with labor disputes, ethnic tensions, and political struggles. For as rail lines pushed westward, they brought an influx of Chinese laborers, Irish immigrants, and displaced Native Americans into direct contact with Anglo settlers, and vigilante groups often targeted these populations, accusing them of theft, sabotage, or disorder when in reality the deeper conflict lay in economic competition and prejudice. and lynchings near rail camps became grim reminders that the noose was used as much to enforce racial and social hierarchies as to punish crime. The expansion of cattle drives along railheads such as Abilene, Dodge City, and Cheyenne also intensified the culture of outlawry and vigilantism, for rail towns swelled with drovers, gamblers, and drifters, creating hotbeds of violence where sheriffs like Wild Bill Hickok or Bat Masterson struggled to impose order, and where citizens frequently resorted to vigilance committees to deal with horse thieves or rustlers accused of disrupting the fragile balance of frontier economies. In Wyoming during the 1880s and 1890s, range wars tied to rail access and cattle shipping often ended in lynchings carried out by hired vigilantes or committees dominated by powerful ranching interests, with small ranchers and alleged rustlers executed without trial in the name of protecting property. And these episodes reveal how the railroad, by concentrating wealth and opportunity, also concentrated tensions that vigilante justice sought to resolve through blood. The cultural power of the outlaw grew alongside these events, as dime novels and sensational newspapers depicted figures like Jesse James, Butch Cassidy, and the Sundance Kid not only as criminals but as anti-heroes standing against corporations, railroads, and banks, narratives that blurred the line between villain and folk champion, and even as vigilantes hunted them, public fascination grew, creating the paradox of society that both feared and admired its outlaws, elevating their stories into legend while their victims demanded justice. This paradox was most visible in the fates of captured outlaws, for when men like Black Jack Ketchum were apprehended in New Mexico after train robberies, vigilante sentiment demanded execution, and the spectacle of hangings drew crowds eager to witness the end of figures who had become both notorious and celebrated, their deaths reinforcing the authority of the noose as the ultimate arbiter of frontier justice. Yet these executions often revealed the cruel brutality of vigilante punishment, as in Ketchum's 1901 hanging in Clayton, New Mexico, which was botched so badly that his head was severed from his body, a gruesome spectacle that horrified onlookers even as it symbolized the persistence of the noose into the new century. The railroads themselves became active participants in this culture of vigilantism, hiring private detectives, armed guards, and even supporting local committees to protect their interests, blurring the line between corporate power and community action, and ensuring that justice on the rails was often shaped by those with wealth and influence rather than impartial law. For Native Americans, the railroad represented not only displacement but also another arena where vigilante violence was justified, as accusations of raids or sabotage against rail lines often led to retaliatory campaigns by settlers or militia groups who used the language of vigilance to mask the broader process of dispossession and conquest, reinforcing how the railroad, the outlaw, and the noose were intertwined in the story of westward expansion. By the 1880s and 1890s, as federal marshals and state courts grew stronger, the open era of vigilante justice began to wane, yet lynchings of train robbers, cattle thieves, and labor agitators persisted, reminders that even with progress and steel rails stretching coast to coast, the impulse to bypass law and enforce order through immediate violence remained deeply embedded in the frontier psyche. The railroad had promised civilization, but it also carried with it the enduring symbols of blood and dust, the outlaw challenging authority, the mob demanding retribution, and the noose swaying in the wind, binding together the story of how Americans sought to impose order on a world transformed by iron, steam, and ambition. As the 19th century wore on and the American frontier evolved from scattered mining camps and cattle ranges into more permanent towns and territories, the figure of the sheriff emerged as a central symbol of law's arrival, a living embodiment of the state's slow but steady attempt to impose order where vigilantism and mob rule had long prevailed. And though the sheriff was often only one man armed with a badge, a revolver, and the fragile authority of distant governments, his rise marked a critical turning point in the story of justice in the West. For the sheriff's presence did not instantly end vigilantism, but it began to channel the energies of frontier communities into formal institutions, transforming justice from something improvised in dusty squares into something tethered, however tenuously, to courts, statutes, and procedure. The origins of the sheriff on the frontier lay in the territorial governments established as settlers pushed westward, for Congress and appointed governors recognized this ability required recognizable officials, and so county lines were drawn, courthouses built, and sheriffs elected or appointed, their duties ranging from collecting taxes and serving writs to arresting criminals and maintaining peace. Yet in practice these duties were carried out under constant strain, as sheriffs often operated with little backup, covering hundreds of square miles, facing armed outlaws, feuding ranchers, and skeptical citizens who trusted their neighbors more than distant governments. Some sheriffs won respect by sheer courage and skill, becoming legendary figures whose names endure in Western lore, while others were corrupt, violent, or ineffectual, proving that the badge alone could not guarantee justice. But in either case, the rise of the sheriff signaled the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the monopoly of violence shifted gradually from mobs to the state. Among the most famous was Sheriff Pat Garrett of Lincoln County, New Mexico, who rose to prominence in the late 1870s and early 1880s during the violent Lincoln County War, a feud rooted in business rivalries that spiraled into bloodshed and produced one of the West's most enduring outlaw figures, Billy the Kid. Garrett's pursuit and eventual killing of Billy in 1881 became a defining story of how the sheriff's authority could bring closure to cycles of vigilante violence, though not without controversy, as some saw Garrett as a hero while others viewed him as a tool of wealthy cattle interests, a reminder that sheriffs were often caught between public duty and private power. In Kansas, sheriffs like Bat Masterson of Ford County gained reputations for balancing toughness with restraint, trying to impose law in cattle towns like Dodge City where saloons, gambling dens, and cowboys fresh from long drives made violence a nightly occurrence. And though Masterson's methods sometimes mirrored a blunt force of vigilantes, his reliance on formal arrests and court processes distinguished him from mobs, demonstrating the slow but real transition toward institutional law. Wyatt Earp, though better remembered as a deputy marshal, also held sheriff's roles in various territories, and his career illustrates the ambiguous space between official law enforcement and vigilante-style justice. For at the famous gunfight at the OK Corral in 1881, Earp and his allies acted under legal authority, but with the same swiftness and finality that characterized earlier vigilance committees, a blending of forms that defined much of the sheriff's rise, law with a badge, but law, still shaped by frontier necessity. The expansion of railroads and telegraphs in the 1870s and 1880s gave sheriffs greater reach, enabling them to coordinate with federal marshals in neighboring counties, while the growth of penitentiaries and circuit courts allowed for longer-term punishments beyond hanging or expulsion, gradually reducing the community's reliance on mobs. Yet the transition was uneven, and sheriffs often faced open resistance from vigilante groups unwilling to see their authority, as in Montana in the 1880s, when citizens clashed with sheriffs over whether to try accused criminals formally or hang them immediately, disputes that revealed how deeply ingrained extrajudicial justice had become. In some regions, sheriffs themselves blurred the line, cooperating with or even leading vigilante actions when they believed official courts could not secure convictions, further complicating the narrative of law's rise. And in other cases, sheriffs became lightning rods of violence, assassinated by outlaws or lynched by mobs when they attempted to stand against community fury. Yet despite these challenges, the growing authority of a sheriff reflected broader social changes. The shift from transient mining camps to settled towns, the establishment of schools, churches, and newspapers, and the push for statehood that demanded reliable institutions of law, all of which created environments where citizens increasingly valued stability over spectacle. By the 1890s, sheriffs across the West were supported by deputies, jailhouses, and stronger connections to state and federal courts, giving them a legitimacy that vigilance committees could not match, and their role became central not only in arresting criminals, but in symbolizing the presence of government itself. For in isolated towns, a sheriff's badge was often the only visible sign that Washington or a state capital had any authority at all. Still, the mythology of the sheriff retained elements of the earlier vigilante ethos. for popular memory celebrated not bureaucrats or judges, but men who stood alone with courage against lawlessness, a narrative that kept alive the romance of individual justice even as institutions solidified. And this mythology persists in Western films and literature, where the sheriff is portrayed as both guardian and gunslinger, bridging the world of mobs and the world of law. In truth, the rise of the sheriff did not eliminate blood in the streets, but it did begin to redirect it, channeling cycles of revenge into structured trials, transforming the news from a mob's weapon into the sentence of a court. And though corruption and violence still plague many sheriffs, their emergence marked a decline of vigilantism as a dominant mode of frontier justice, a shift that signaled the slow maturation of the West from lawless frontier to governed territory. The sheriff became the hinge between two worlds, embodying both the rough pragmatism of the frontier and the institutional authority of the state, a figure whose rise reminds us that order in the West was not achieved overnight but built slowly, painfully, and often precariously, on the contested ground between mob rule and the rule of law. As the American frontier moved from transient mining camps and cattle towns toward more permanent settlements, vigilance committees, once seen as temporary responses to lawlessness, often evolved into something far more enduring and influential, instruments of political power that shaped elections, controlled local governments, and sometimes dictated the very course of statehood. For in communities where institutions were weak and authority contested, the same groups of armed men who claimed to defend citizens against outlaws or corrupt officials quickly discovered that their influence could extend well beyond the gallows, and their transformation from grassroots defenders into political machines became one of the most significant and troubling legacies of frontier vigilantism. The most prominent example is San Francisco, where the vigilance committees of 1851 and 1856 not only carried out arrests, trials, and executions, but also directly challenged and in many cases supplanted municipal authority, presenting themselves as a true voice of the people against corrupt politicians and criminal gangs. In 1856, after the assassination of newspaper editor James King of William, the Vigilance Committee grew to nearly 6,000 members, organized like a militia with armed patrols, cannons, and a central headquarters, and their power extended far beyond punishing murderers. They arrested judges, seized ballot boxes, and effectively controlled the city's political life for months, claiming to purge corruption while in practice consolidating power among merchant elites who dominated the committee's leadership. Their influence did not vanish when they disbanded, for many committee leaders went on to form the People's Party, which dominated San Francisco politics in the following decade, demonstrating how vigilante movements could serve as stepping stones of formal political authority. Similar patterns appeared elsewhere in the West, where vigilance committees aligned themselves with business interests, ranching barons, or mining companies, using the rhetoric of law and order to suppress rivals and secure economic dominance. In Montana during the 1860s, the vigilantes who hanged Sheriff Henry Plummer and dozens of alleged road agents did not simply fade away. Many of them became pillars of the emerging territorial government, their authority legitimized by the narrative that they had saved the region from lawlessness. And this blending of vigilante origins with political legitimacy ensured that the boundary between extrajudicial justice and formal governance remained blurred. In mining regions of Colorado and Nevada, vigilance committees frequently acted in ways that served the interests of wealthier claim holders, targeting small prospectors or immigrants accused of theft while protecting the rights of established companies. And in cattle country, powerful ranching associations used vigilante tactics not only to punish rustlers, but to intimidate smaller ranchers, influence elections, and pressure territorial legislatures to adopt laws favorable to their interests, culminating in episodes such as the Johnson County War in Wyoming in 1892, when large cattle barons effectively turned vigilante action into private warfare under the guise of protecting property. Newspapers often celebrated these movements as expressions of popular sovereignty, but critics pointed out that they represented the capture of justice by local elites who used the aura of community protection to enforce their own dominance. In some cases, vigilantes became so entangled with politics that they shaped the path to statehood, for territories seeking admission to the Union needed to demonstrate stability, and the suppression of crime, whether through law or through vigilantism, was presented as evidence of readiness for self-government, even if that suppression came through methods that undermined democratic principles. Vigilantes also influenced elections directly, using intimidation, ballot box control, and the threat of violence to sway outcomes, particularly in contested towns where rival factions vied for dominance. And in places like San Francisco, Virginia City, and Denver, elections were often remembered as tense affairs where the presence of armed men loomed as heavily as the ballots themselves. In this sense, vigilantism was not merely an emergency response to crime, but an enduring political culture, one in which the performance of justice, hangings, expulsions, public trials, was as much about demonstrating authority as it was about reducing lawlessness. The image of the noose and the gallows became political symbols, reminders that those who control violence also control legitimacy, and this lesson carried forward into the broader history of the West, where the line between vigilantes and politicians was often indistinguishable. The long-term effect was a legacy of ambivalence toward formal institutions. Many frontier citizens accepted sheriffs, judges, and legislatures only insofar as they reflected the will of those who had previously wielded vigilante power, and when they did not, communities were quick to revert to mob action, convinced that the people retained ultimate sovereignty to act outside the law. This paradox, of vigilantes both paving the way for governance and undermining its foundations, reveals the deep tensions of the American frontier, where democracy was both celebrated and suspended, where law was both invoked and bypassed, and where political power often wore the mask of popular justice even as it entrenched the rule of elites. The vigilantes who once patrolled streets and strung up criminals under torchlight thus became part of the very fabric of Western politics, their legacy visible not only in the history of violence but in the institutions and power structures that emerged from it, ensuring that the rise of law in the West was never a simple story of mobs giving way to order, but a far more complex tale of how violence, politics, and legitimacy intertwined in the crucible of the frontier. The story of frontier vigilantism cannot be told without confronting the reality that lynch law, the practice of extrajudicial execution by mobs, was not applied equally but fell disproportionately on racial and ethnic minorities, whose presence on the expanding frontier collided with Anglo-American visions of dominance. And in this collision, vigilante justice became both a tool of community protection and a weapon of racial exclusion, enforcing hierarchies through fear and violence. For while Anglo settlers often justified lynchings of white outlaws as necessary acts of frontier defense, the same mechanisms were directed with far greater fury at African Americans, Mexicans, Chinese immigrants, and native peoples, their executions and expulsions framed not only as punishment for alleged crimes, but as warnings that their place in frontier society was conditional, precarious, and subject to the will of the majority. The term lynch law itself had deep roots in American history, originating in the Revolutionary era with Charles Lynch of Virginia, whose extrajudicial punishments of loyalists gave the practice its name, but on the frontier it took on a wider, more brutal scope. For here lynching became a common response not only to theft or murder, but to interracial tensions, labor disputes, and the desire to assert dominance over populations seen as outsiders. In California during the gold rush, Chinese immigrants who came in large numbers to work the mines and later the railroads faced some of the most relentless campaigns of vigilante violence. Newspapers of the 1850s and 1860s often portrayed Chinese workers as dishonest, immoral, or alien, and vigilance committees, fueled by prejudice and economic competition, expelled them from camps, burned Chinatowns, and carried out lynchings under the guise of protecting American miners. The Los Angeles Chinese Massacre of 1871 remains one of the most infamous episodes, when a mob of nearly 500 Anglos and Latinos stormed the Chinese quarter after the death of a white man during a gang dispute, dragging Chinese men into the streets, hanging 19 and looting homes and businesses, all while city officials stood by, an atrocity that shocked even some contemporary observers, but revealed how easily lynch law became a vehicle for racial hatred rather than justice. In Texas, lynchings of Mexican Americans were widespread throughout the 19th century, particularly in the borderlands where disputes over cattle, land, and political control fueled violence. Anglo vigilantes frequently accused Mexican ranchers of rustling or banditry, and in countless cases men were executed without trial, their deaths reinforcing Anglo dominance in contested regions. With the infamous Porvenna massacre of 1918, though later echoing the same patterns of frontier, vigilantism extended into the 20th century. African Americans, both enslaved and free, also bore the brunt of lynch law, particularly in the post-Civil War West, where freedmen sought opportunities as cowboys, farmers, or laborers, but found themselves vulnerable to accusations and mob violence. In states like Texas, Kansas, and Colorado, black men were lynched for alleged assaults, thefts, or simply for defying racial norms. And the spectacle of lynching served as a tool of terror that policed the boundaries of racial hierarchy on the frontier just as it did in the South. Native Americans, too, were frequent targets of extrajudicial killings, especially when accused of raids, horse theft, or violence against settlers, though in many cases entire communities were punished for the actions of individuals, as vigilante mobs attacked villages or carried out massacres under the language of lynch law, extending punishment indiscriminately and reinforcing the dispossession that defined native-settler relations. The newspapers that covered these events often legitimized them, portraying victims as dangerous outsiders whose deaths preserved order, and in doing so they contributed to a culture in which racialized lynching was seen not as lawless brutality but as an extension of community defense, a framing that would echo into the broader American tradition of lynching well into the 20th century. It is important to note that while lynching of white men certainly occurred on the frontier, horse thieves, murderers, and outlaws often met their end of the rope. These acts were often treated as grim necessities, while the lynchings of racial minorities carried an additional layer of exclusion, meant not only to punish individuals but to send a collective message of dominance, and the public spectacles of these events, often carried out in front of crowds that included women and children, reinforced the performative nature of racial violence in frontier society. The echoes of lynch law extended beyond the frontier, stories spread in dime novels, newspapers, and later film, embedding the image of the noose into the mythology of the West, but stripped of the racial realities that underpinned much of its use, leaving behind a romanticized picture of swift frontier justice that ignored its role in enforcing white supremacy. Historians today, drawing on court records, newspaper accounts, and oral histories, estimate that thousands of lynchings occurred in the western states between the mid-19th century and the early 20th, many of them directed at minorities whose very presence was deemed a threat to the racial order of expanding settlements. And this legacy connects the frontier not only to its own violent past, but to the broader American history of racial terror. In reflecting on lynch law in the West, one must confront the duality of its meaning. For some, it symbolized community defense in lawless lands, but for many it was an ever-present reminder that justice was not blind but deeply racialized, its rope tightening most often around the necks of those who stood outside the boundaries of Anglo-American power. The echoes of this history remind us that vigilantism was never merely about crime or order, but about defining who belonged and who did not. And in this sense, lynch law was as much about drawing the racial map of the frontier as it was about punishing transgression, its shadow stretching long after the frontier closed, into a century where the noose remained one of the most potent symbols of fear and control in American life. By the closing decades of the 19th century, the American frontier was undergoing a transformation that signaled not only the end of open range and ungoverned wilderness, but also the gradual decline of vigilante committees, whose dominance of justice in earlier decades gave way to the slow, uneven rise of formal institutions of law. For as railroads, telegraphs, and state had expanded across the West, the conditions that had once made extrajudicial action appear necessary were steadily eroded, replaced by sheriffs with deputies, circuit-riding judges, territorial courts, and, eventually, penitentiaries, and police forces. Yet this transition was neither smooth nor immediate, and the last committees of the frontier reflected both the persistence of old habits and the tensions a society caught between two worlds, one shaped by communal justice in the absence of authority, and another increasingly defined by centralized state power. The decline of vigilance committees was most evident in growing cities such as Denver, San Francisco, and Salt Lake City, where permanent governments and law enforcement structures gradually reduced the space for citizen mobs to claim legitimacy. But in rural areas and isolated towns, the committees lingered well into the 1880s and even 1890s, often reappearing during moments of panic, economic crisis, or perceived threats to order. In Montana, for example, the vigilantes who had executed Henry Plummer in 1864 remained a force for decades, resurfacing whenever crime or corruption seemed unchecked, and though their actions gradually became more controversial, they continued to influence local politics, showing how deeply embedded the culture of vigilantism remained in certain regions. In Texas and New Mexico, cattle rustling and land disputes frequently provoked the revival of committees even as sheriffs and courts operated, with ranching associations and local elites sometimes encouraging vigilante violence to enforce their economic dominance, blurring the line between private power and public authority. Yet by the 1880s, the expansion of federal institutions such as the U.S. Marshal Service, the growing authority of state courts, and the ability of telegraphs and railroads to connect communities to distant capitals meant that fewer citizens accepted the argument that mobs were the only option, and this growing reliance on formal law reflected broader social changes. The stabilization of towns with schools, churches, and businesses, the arrival of women and families in greater numbers, bringing pressure for predictability, and the rising national concern with the image of America as a civilized, modern nation rather than a land of mobs and lynchings. Even so, the last committees left dramatic marks on frontier history. In Wyoming in 1892, during the Johnson County War, cattle barons effectively revived vigilante practices by hiring armed gunmen to eliminate suspected rustlers, a private army acting in defiance of local authority until the U.S. cavalry intervened, an event that underscored both the persistence of vigilante impulses and the growing strength of state power to curb them. In Idaho's Coeur-d'Alene mining district during the labor wars of the 1890s, vigilante-style groups emerged once more, this time aligned with business interests seeking to suppress union activity, showing how the old language of protecting order could be reproposed for new conflicts in an industrializing West. Yet these later committees were increasingly condemned in newspapers, courts, and legislatures, reflecting the changing moral climate of a nation where extrajudicial violence was no longer celebrated as heroic, but increasingly seen as a stain on American democracy. The decline of vigilante committees also paralleled the rise of lynching as a national phenomenon, particularly in the South and border states, where mob violence shifted from frontier necessity to systemic racial terror, suggesting that while the specific committees of the mining camps and cattle towns were fading, the culture of extrajudicial punishment had not disappeared but had been reshaped for a new era. Still, on the frontier itself, the end of committees marked a symbolic passage, the transformation of the West from a region defined by improvisation to one tethered to the structures of modern governance. The symbolism of this shift was captured in the growing presence of courthouses and jails in towns that once relied on gallows in the square, and in the image of sheriffs supported by deputies and federal marshals, replacing masked men with bylaws scribbled on scraps of paper. Historians often describe this decline not as a clean break, but as a fading echo, for even in the 20th century sporadic acts of vigilantism appeared in rural Western communities, but the broad trend was unmistakable. The committees that had once claimed to embody the will of the people now looked increasingly like relics of a less stable past. Their decline was hastened by the changing memory of the frontier itself, as dime novels and later Hollywood films romanticized vigilante justice, sanitizing its violence and erasing its prejudices, while real communities sought legitimacy by distancing themselves from the image of mob rule, preferring to present themselves as governed by law and order. Thus the last committees occupy an ambiguous place in history, remembered locally with a mix of pride and embarrassment, nationally as part of the mythology of the Wild West, but ultimately overshadowed by the institutions that replaced them. Their story reminds us that the frontier did not simply evolve from chaos to order, but passed through a long twilight where law and mob coexisted uneasily until the balance tipped decisively toward the former. The decline of vigilante committees in the age of law was less a triumphal moment than a slow adjustment driven by technology, demography, and the demands of statehood, yet it marked the end of an era when ordinary citizens, armed with rifles and a sense of righteousness, could claim the power of life and death without the sanction of the courts, leaving behind a legacy of blood, dust, and unresolved questions about the meaning of justice in America's most turbulent frontier. By the early 20th century, as the last echoes of vigilante committees faded and the American West transitioned from lived reality into collective memory, a new force rose to shape how generations would come to understand frontier justice: Hollywood and popular culture, which took the messy, complicated, often brutal history of mobs, sheriffs, outlaws, and lynchings and transformed it into legend, stripping away nuance and presenting the West as a theater of morality plays, where rugged heroes stood against villainous desperados and justice was delivered cleanly by the gun or the gallows. The truth of the frontier, that vigilante justice was often messy, politically manipulated, racially biased, and as destructive as it was protective, was increasingly overshadowed by stories crafted for entertainment, first in dime novels of the late 19th century and then on screen, beginning with early silent films like The Great Train Robbery in 1903, which crystallized the outlaw figure into a cinematic archetype. Hollywood inherited and magnified the myth born of sensational newspapers and frontier memoirs, exaggerating the roles of figures like Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, and Jesse James, turning them into larger-than-life icons whose confrontations symbolize the triumph of law over chaos, even when historical truth told a far makier tale. Wyatt Earp, for instance, whose role in the OK Corral gunfight in Tombstone was complex and disputed, became immortalized as a quintessential lawman in countless Western films, from John Ford, My Darling Clementine, 1946, to later reinterpretations. His controversial alliances with gamblers and his use of extrajudicial violence largely erased in favor of a narrative of stoic heroism. Similarly, Jesse James, whose robberies were acts of violence rooted in post-Civil War politics and personal ambition, was reimagined as a folk hero, an American Robin Hood defying corrupt railroads and banks, a legend cemented by both silent films and later classics like Jesse James, 1939. Despite the absence of evidence that James ever redistributed wealth to the poor. These cinematic reinterpretations shaped not only American culture but global perceptions of the frontier, making the Hollywood West synonymous with rugged landscapes, six-shooter duels, and vigilante justice framed as moral necessity rather than chaotic improvisation. The role of vigilante committees themselves was softened or reframed, often depicted as communities banding together to fight evil, rarely shown as a politically motivated or racially charged forces they truly were, and lynchings, so central to the reality of frontier justice, were often sanitized or omitted, replaced with quick-draw duels that allowed for heroism without the unsettling spectacle of mobs. Even when films acknowledge the darker side of vigilante action, as in Fritz Lang's Fury, 1936, one of the first Hollywood films to explicitly address lynching, the story was transposed into a contemporary setting, distancing it from the mythology of the frontier and preserving the Western as a space of simpler, cleaner morality. This pattern reflected broader cultural needs. Americans of the 20th century, grappling with industrialization, world wars, and racial conflict, turned to the Western as a genre that reassured them of national identity, portraying the frontier as a crucible where justice, courage, and order triumphed, even if by the gun. The reality that frontier justice was often racialized, economically driven, and unstable was incompatible with the myth Americans wanted to tell themselves, and so truth was reshaped into legend. Yet historians have long pointed out that even in its mythologized form, the Hollywood frontier carried echoes of the anxieties of its time. Films of the 1930s and 1940s often presented sheriffs and vigilantes as guardians of democracy during the Depression and World War II, while films of the 1950s and 1960s began to question the morality of the West, reflecting Cold War and civil rights tensions, with directors like Anthony Mann and later Sam Peckinpah portraying the brutality of frontier life more starkly. Peckinpah's A Wild Bunch, 1969, for instance, showed vigilante-style justice as bloody, tragic, and morally ambiguous, closer to historical reality than earlier films. The revisionist westerns of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, from Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven, 1992, to Kevin Costner's Open Range, 2003, have gone further in deconstructing the myths, portraying lawmen, vigilantes, and outlaws as flawed, brutal, and human, a reminder that truth and legend have always been in dialogue. Still, the enduring dominance of the Hollywood frontier and global imagination means that for many people, the idea of vigilante justice in the West remains inseparable from images of John Wayne riding into town to restore order or Gary Cooper standing alone at high noon, archetypes that bear little resemblance to the chaotic, racially charged, and politically entangled reality of 19th century vigilantism. The tension between legend and truth is not just a matter of entertainment but of memory. The stories we tell about the past shape how we understand justice, democracy, and violence in the present. By recasting vigilantes as heroes and ignoring the darker realities of lynch law, Hollywood contributed to a national narrative that often glorifies extrajudicial action, reinforcing the idea that justice can and should be seized outside the law when institutions falter, a belief with echoes in modern debates about authority and violence. At the same time, the persistence of historians, documentarians, and revisionist storytellers ensures that the truth continues to surface, reminding us that the frontier was not a stage play of good and evil but a complex and contested space where survival, prejudice, ambition, and fear shaped justice in ways both inspiring and horrifying. The Hollywood frontier, then, is less alive than a selective memory, a lens that filtered blood and dust into myth, creating legends that endure even as the truth demands recognition. Though the committees disbanded, the mobs dispersed, and the gallows of dusty mining camps were dismantled or left to rot, the legacy of vigilante justice in the American West did not vanish with the closing of the frontier. It lingered like a ghost, shaping memory, politics, and culture long after the noose was cut down, haunting communities with stories of swift punishment, contested heroism, and unresolved injustices. For the families of those hanged in places like Bannack, Virginia City, and San Francisco, the ghost was immediate and personal, a stigma carried for generations as children grew up knowing their fathers or brothers had been condemned not by courts but by mobs, their guilt or innocence often left forever uncertain. Widows fled towns, children changed their names, and descendants struggled with dual inheritance, local law that branded their kin as criminals, and private memories that questioned whether they had been victims of paranoia, politics, or prejudice. In towns across Montana, Colorado, and California, graves of vigilante victims became uneasy landmarks, whispered about in folklore, visited by curious travelers, or, in some cases, marked by historical plaques that celebrated the vigilantes more than they mourned condemned, revealing how public memory often lionized the committees while silencing those they executed. Yet even among descendants of vigilantes themselves, ghosts persisted. For the men who carried out hangings, who tied knots and read sentences before crowds, often left behind diaries, letters, or confessions that revealed unease, guilt, or doubt, some admitting in old age that not every man they executed had been guilty, that fear and hysteria had sometimes driven the rope as much as evidence. And these confessions stand as haunting reminders that vigilante justice, even when remembered as heroic, carried a moral burden that did not easily fade. Beyond families and individuals, the ghost of vigilantism lingered in the racial scars of the frontier, for communities of Chinese immigrants, Mexican Americans, African Americans, and Native peoples remembered the violence directed at them not as justice but as persecution, their oral histories passing down stories of lynchings, expulsions, and massacres that official histories often ignored, ensuring that the wounds of vigilante violence remained raw long after towns erected courthouses and sheriffs replaced mobs. In Los Angeles, the site of the 1871 Chinese massacre became a point of memory for the city's Chinese community, a reminder that their ancestors had been targeted not by outlaws but by their neighbors. And in Texas and New Mexico, families of Mexican victims of lynch law carried stories of injustice that shaped identity and resistance for generations. These ghosts were not confined to local memory. They became national when lynching evolved from a frontier phenomenon into a systemic practice of racial terror across the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the noose of the frontier reappearing in southern towns and border states as a tool of white supremacy. Its lineage traceable to the extrajudicial practices that have flourished in western mining camps and cattle ranges. In this way, vigilante justice casts a long shadow, its ghosts haunting not only the west of the entire nation, embedding the idea that mobs could claim legitimacy when institutions faltered. The mythology of the West, amplified by newspapers, dime novels, and later Hollywood, further complicated this haunting, for while local descendants remembered trauma and injustice, popular culture celebrated vigilantes as heroes, creating a dissonance between lived history and remembered legend. Tourists visiting Virginia City or San Francisco in the 20th century encountered museums and reenactments that presented vigilantes as civic saviors, rarely acknowledging the ambiguities or racial exclusions of their actions, a selective memory that preserved the ghost of vigilantism in sanitized form, stripping it of blood while preserving its aura of rugged justice. Historians working in the mid and late 20th century began to challenge this narrative, uncovering court records, testimonies, and forgotten accounts that reveal the complexity and cruelty of frontier vigilantism. But even as scholarship deepened, the cultural memory of the West remained stubbornly tied to its myths, ensuring that the ghosts remained half-seen, flickering between truth and legend. The psychological legacy of vigilantism also endures, reflected in the American fascination with self-reliance, frontier justice, and the idea that communities or individuals can and should act outside the law when institutions fail, a belief that echoes in modern debates about militias, neighborhood watches, and extrajudicial violence. Though separated by centuries, the logic that fueled committees in San Francisco or Bannack still haunt the American imagination, raising questions about when, if ever, law can be bypassed in the name of justice. The physical ghosts of vigilante justice remain, too, in weathered markers, museums, and preserved gallows that stand in tourist towns, drawing visitors with the allure of the Wild West while silently testifying to lives cut short by rope and crowd. They were stained by a history that resists forgetting. In Bannack State Park, visitors still see the saloon balcony where Henry Plummer was hanged, a sight that evokes curiosity and unease, while in San Francisco plaques commemorate the Vigilance Committee's headquarters, their inscriptions reflecting more pride than regret, revealing how ghosts can be honored as heroes in one narrative and mourned as victims in another. These places embody the unsettled legacy of vigilantism. Was it protection or persecution, heroism or tyranny, necessity or hysteria? The ghosts whisper all answers at once, refusing closure. In this sense, the ghosts of vigilante justice remind us that the frontier did not simply end when the railroads closed the wilderness or when states joined the Union. Its unresolved moral dilemmas continued to shape American society, lingering as cautionary tales about the dangers of fear-driven justice and as enduring myths about courage in the face of lawlessness. They haunt not only the landscapes of the West, but the very idea of American identity, where freedom, law, and violence have always been entangled. The noose may have been cut down, the mobs dispersed, and the committees dissolved, but their shadows remain in memory, in politics, in culture, and in the uneasy silence of history, where the ghosts of vigilantism still walk. The saga of vigilante justice in the American West ends not with the crack of a gunshot or the snap of a rope, but with the long shadow these acts left across history, a shadow stretching from the mining camps of California to the cattle ranges of Texas, from the railroad towns of Kansas to the mountain settlements of Montana, and finally into the conscience of a nation still grappling with the meaning of justice, democracy, and violence. For nearly a century, frontier vigilantism existed in the space where law was weak or absent, where settlers, miners, ranchers, and merchants convinced themselves that survival required action outside the courts, and in that space they created a culture of justice that was at once communal and chaotic, protective and destructive, heroic and horrifying. The gallows raised in Bannack, the torchlit meetings in San Francisco, the mob parades through Texas streets, and the massacres carried out against native and immigrant communities were not aberrations but central features of a frontier society improvising order. Yet each of these events carried costs far beyond the moment. Lives ended without trial, families destroyed, communities scarred, and the principles of fairness and due process undermined. Over time, sheriffs, judges, and federal marshals expanded their reach. Courthouses and penitentiaries replaced saloons and scaffoldings, and states claimed the authority once wielded by mobs. But even as vigilantism declined, its legacy persisted, not only in the families who remembered, not only in the scars carved into marginalized communities, but in the mythology of the West itself, a mythology that elevated vigilantes into symbols of courage while often silencing the voices of their victims. Dime novels, newspapers, and later Hollywood turned the messy, ambiguous reality of extrajudicial justice into a stage of clear heroes and villains, presenting stories of fearless lawmen and righteous citizens triumphing over desperados, and in doing so they created an enduring legend that continues to shape how Americans imagine the frontier and, more importantly, how they imagine justice. Yet the truth, preserved in diaries, letters, court records, and oral histories, tells us something more complex, that vigilante justice was often as much about fear as about safety, as much about power as about protection, as much about exclusion as about order. The truth forces us to see the frontier not only as a land of opportunity and resilience, but also as a crucible where democracy faltered, where communities sacrificed fairness for speed, and where the line between hero and tyrant was blurred by dust, blood, and desperation. In remembering this history, we are haunted by questions that echo across time. What does society do when its institutions fail? Who decides what justice means when law cannot or will not act? And how easily can the language of protection slip into the practice of persecution? These questions are not confined to the past, for the ghosts of vigilantism remain in the American psyche, shaping debates about authority, community, and violence, surfacing whenever citizens claim the right to act outside the law in the name of safety. The American West was a proving ground for these dilemmas, its vigilantes both symbols of grassroots strength and warnings of the dangers of mob rule, and to study their history is to confront the fragile boundary between order and chaos, freedom and tyranny, justice and vengeance. The outro of this story is not a simple closing but a reflection, that in the history of the frontier we find both the resilience of communities determined to survive and the tragedies born when fear replaces fairness, and it is in this tension that the legacy of blood and dust resides. The vigilantes of the West are gone, their committees disbanded, their gallows dismantled, their mobs dispersed into memory, but their shadows remain in monuments, in folklore, in film, and in the uneasy silence of graves that still lie in forgotten corners of western towns, unmarked or barely remembered, testaments of lives ended in haste and justice denied. To walk those landscapes today is to sense the weight of that past, to feel the ghosts that linger where order was once just a word, and to recognize that the story of the American frontier is not only about expansion and progress, but about the price paid when law gives way to fury. In the end, the tale of vigilante justice is not only about the West but about America itself, a reminder that the struggle to define justice is never finished, that the balance between law and violence, between democracy and mob rule, remains as urgent now as it was in the days of gold camps and cattle towns. The outro is, therefore, a challenge, to remember honestly, to strip away the comforting myths, to see the blood and dust not as legend but as history, and to carry forward the lessons of the frontier into the present, lest the ghost of vigilante justice rise again.